Welcome to episode 17 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. This month, I had the honor to speak to Reverend Dr. Emilie Towns. Dr. Towns is Dean of Vanderbilt Divinity School and a distinguished professor of womanist ethics and society. She's the author of Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil, Breaking the Fine Reign of Death, African American Health and a Womanist Ethic of Care, In a Blaze of Glory, Womanist Spirituality as Social Witness and Womanist Justice, Womanist Hope. In this episode, she spoke about representation, counter-memory, philosophy, Toni Morrison, beloved community, Ida B. Wells and anti-fascism, trauma, and empire. Big thanks to Awareness for the music, and here's a short jingle from another Channel Zero Network member.
It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying, there is no running, there is no hiding, there's only fighting or dying. It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying, there is no running, there is no hiding, there's only fighting or dying.
It's Going Down is a digital community center from anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements. Our mission is to provide an autonomous and resilient platform to publicize and promote revolutionary theory and action.
Go to itsgoingdown.org for daily updates. Check out our online store for ways to donate, and rate and follow us on iTunes if you like this podcast.
Hello, Dr. Towns.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Chris.
I guess I'll begin with my first question.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure this is more than just a moment, but has been an ongoing process through your life. But can you share a story or experience of when you started to see through the spectacle or spectacles of propaganda, whether it was capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, or a braided system of all three of these?
Ask the question again. It feels like part of it's missing or an assumption is being made. So I want to really get at what you're trying to ask me.
Yeah, kind of a moment when you started to maybe see or pierce through the hegemony of the U.S. where white supremacy and patriarchy are very normalized, and you started to break through that and see.
Well, probably the earliest memory I have of saying something's not right here, or what we now would call the dominant narrative does not hold, when I was, 5 or 6 years old, and we were. No, that memory's not as clear. Let me go a little bit later in life. In 4th grade. No, it was not. It was 3rd grade. I decided to read all the books in our school's library. We were a segregated school system in Durham, North Carolina. And I started out reading from one end of the library to the other. And, looking back on it, it was a small library, as libraries for black schools weren't that huge, but it seemed enormous to me. At the time, and I finally was coming near the end, and had worked my way to the encyclopedias, and so started reading all of the encyclopedia. We had World Book in our library, and got to the S volume, and eventually happened upon slavery. And that particular edition of World Book had just about every stereotypical picture you could find of happy black folk in slavery. And I thought to myself, no, that's not what slavery was about. So I took the book to my teacher and the head librarian, and they sort of looked at me and said, what's wrong? And I just opened the page, and they said, okay, you go on and we'll take care of this. So later that night, when I got home, I told my mother about what I had discovered. And so we went to look at our set of World Book encyclopedias, and it was a more recent edition. And those pictures did not appear in it, which was good because there had been progress. But needless to say, if this happened to me in third or fourth grade, and I'm still remembering it, it helped me understand that things are not what they appear to be, even when they're in print. Mm-hmm. And there's something wrong sometimes, and you need to say something about it. You need to tell somebody, preferably a person in a position to do something about it. So I would say that's probably the earliest clear memory I have of knowing that the dominant narrative was probably full of a lot of BS in many places.
Thank you for sharing that story.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like your concept of the fantastic hegemonic imagination, of the stuff we make up about each other that's not true, but starts to become this myth that we believe, and it holds inequality in place.
You've got it.
I was wondering if you could talk about rejecting hegemony in the classroom by using counter memory. And to put this into context for the listeners, I'd like to quote from your book, Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil.
Okay.
You say, quote, counter memory begins with the particular to move into the universal, and it looks to the past for micro-histories to force a reconsideration of flawed, incomplete, or vastly circumscribed histories. This focus on localized experiences of oppression in counter memory allows me to recenter dominant narratives into a reframing of what constitutes the universal, thus getting into the interior life of evil to unhinge its underpinnings.
Okay. Well, I think, as I think about any given course I teach, the power of bringing other voices into the classroom setting begins from the very moment I start thinking about the course itself, even if it's a course that I have taught before, because what I want to do is introduce students to different thinkers or new thinkers in conversation with whatever the theme of the course may be. And those new thinkers and different thinkers tend to be people with darker skin. They tend to be women. They tend to be queer voices, because I have no assurance that up until the point that they come into my classroom setting that they've had an encounter with different voices in their other classes, be it in other schools, other educational settings, even within the school I may be teaching in, because I don't look over the shoulder, even as a dean, I don't look over the shoulder of the faculty to see what they're teaching. That's inappropriate, and that's a violation of free speech. So I only can control what happens, or try to control, what happens in my own class. That process of bringing in the alternative voices, bringing in not folks that aren't necessarily designed by their own design, thinking that what they're doing is transgressive, but simply offering another narrative, is something I care about very deeply, because I think it's crucial that we realize the great diversity of thought that's out there in the world, and our own sometimes provincial knowledge is not absolute and it's not universal. And we have to be in conversation with the voices of others, even if we disagree with them. I'm not interested in trying to get students to agree with me. In fact, it's a boring classroom if they only agree with me, and it's not learning. It's not helping students or myself think new thoughts or see new perspectives. And that's part of what counter memory helps us do. It says there's more there than what you hear all the time. There's more there that you can use for the greater good. Counter-memory can also function as yet another tool of hegemony. It has a two-edged sword. Some folks would argue, well, white supremacists are using counter-memory. They are. But is it for the greater good? So you always have to be thinking through, what are you trying to do in the end? What is the purpose of this educational moment? What is the purpose of this rhetorical move? Is it to create greater spaces of grace and hope and love and faith and all those things that we talk about that are so crucial to the Christian drama? Or is it something that is encouraging us to hunker down and look within and sort of crouch into protect posture that doesn't want anybody who doesn't look like us or think like us be a part of the conversation? So counter-memory is the beginning of a great movement towards diversity.
And do you also see, like you mentioned, counter-memory is so broad that when counter-memory is instituted, such as talking about the evils of slavery, but maybe that's just one side that's finally being pushed into classrooms, but if you go farther and you actually show the counter-memory of slave revolts, which actually led to the end of slavery, is another thing that's really helpful for classrooms, is showing resistance and not just the evils that were done.
Yeah.
And you've been seeing that break open a lot more within indigenous studies. I'm in Denver, Colorado right now, which is the homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. And when I was teaching Colorado history, it started with mining. So we went and we got a whole bunch of books and articles and made the students read about the actual whose lands these are for the last 10,000 years. And that created a lot more conversations.
I would imagine it would, and I would imagine people often didn't know that.
No, yeah, they think of Colorado as mining and skiing and now legalized marijuana, and not the correct narrative. I was wondering, you speak about creolization of discourses. Often when you look at philosophy and the role of the Enlightenment and liberalism, it seemed to be creating this fantastic hegemonic imagination of global white supremacy. And if you look at John Locke, he was invested in the Royal African Company. Hegel, who even said the flora and the fauna of America was inferior to Europe. How do you approach philosophy with this? Do you take this with the creolization of blending these thoughts together for a purpose of liberation?
Well, if you don't know what people have said about you or others that is either negative or positive, it's really hard to craft an agenda for liberation or freedom, I think, because you're doing it in a vacuum. You're doing it with your hopes and wishes, and in this case, something that I think is much more problematic, you're doing it in the abstract. And we're talking about concrete lives here and how much it matters what our words and our thoughts are. So, people may not want to hear what Hegel had to say or Kant had to say or Jefferson had to say about certain groups of folks. But that's part of the American narrative. That's part of American history, U.S. history. And we need to know it. It doesn't make that everything they said or did moot or unusable. It puts it in context. How much do we reflect those things they have said or done? How much can we learn from what they've said or done? And how can we not make the mistakes they made? There's that old saying, don't make the same mistake, make new ones. Well, how do we make new ones that hopefully are on a journey to making us a better place for greater and greater and greater numbers of people?
For my next question, I'd like to talk about a wonderful woman who recently passed. and that's Toni Morrison.
Mm-hmm.
And you've written a great deal on Morrison, spent some time with her as well.
Mm-hmm.
And she spoke about the dancing mind and the beauty of two open minds engaging. And she passed away earlier this month.
Mm-hmm.
She was a wonderful preacher herself. I believe in her book Paradise, she wrote 2 sermons, one that was in the character's head and one spoken to the parishioners.
Right.
Can you speak on Toni Morrison and her influence on you and womanism?
Well, yeah. Morrison was a tour de force who was first and foremost concerned about speaking the truth and telling the truth of Black lives in nuanced and complex ways, and taking on topics that people really wish she hadn't. In The Bluest Eye, what does it mean for a child to learn self-loathing? In Sula, what does it mean to have boundaries that are permeable and porous at best, and you still try to stay in relationship? And the woman is the strong one of the story, always. Yeah, it just goes on and on and on. In Beloved, what does it mean that a mother's love for her children means she kills them to keep them from the horrors of slavery? What in the world were we doing in slavery where a mother would believe that was an act of love, to kill her own child? What were the horrors there? Morrison uncovered all that stuff in her writing and asked us to look at ourselves and look at each other and say, where are you? Where are we in the midst of this story, these characters' lives? And so what she always did for me when I read her, and she was no easy read by any stretch of the imagination, is that she caused me to think first with my imagination, not with reason and rationality, but to imagine the world that she was constructing, and then imagine myself in it. And then what could I learn as somebody trained to do reason and rationality from the characters that she gave me or gives us? So I was never comforted by a Morrison novel. I may have liked it, I may have disliked it, but I never got comfort from it. It was something that helped me realize just how dense life is and Black life is. And it was, we lost something special when she died. We really did. But I take heart. She was 88. She had a long life, so I should not mourn too long, because she would probably get irritated and say, you really need to get on with it. So
I really like the story that you shared about meeting Toni Morrison at her plenary speech, mm-hmm. where she came in with her grand entrance and wearing mm-hmm. her Nobel Prize, and she told you all womanist writers that she was impressed with the solidarity that you all had with each other, and not to
mm-hmm.
lose that.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed that story.
Yeah, we got fussed at.
So you've spoken about forming witnessing communities, and that's mm-hmm. something we need to do more. And I was thinking that we're really seeing this with mutual aid and solidarity with the Abolish ICE campaigns, mm-hmm. and the sanctuary movement, which has been growing again since its height during the Reagan administration in the 80s. But I mm-hmm. kind of see these as beloved communities, and I was mm-hmm. wondering, where are you seeing these witnessing communities being formed, or where you think they should start growing?
Well, the thing that does not help us is if we tend to think that things exist only if media cover it. And there has always been a network of witnessing folk who were trying their best to be faithful to the gospel message of hope and love and faith and truth and all those things. So sometimes I see them in local churches They tend to be smaller churches because it's hard to get a big church all going in the same direction. But I've seen some pastors try to bring their larger churches in line with that, and it's a long haul. But they're not giving up, and that in and of itself, even the attempt, I think, helps form the kind of, or at least the foundation of a beloved community that may take another generation to really take root in that setting. But the point is, you begin and you try. I think I see it also sometimes in community agencies that really have their pulse on the community, as opposed to being sort of bureaucratic sounding boards, but folks that really dig in and are actively involved in the communities in which they sit, and concerned about people's lives, and understanding that what we're trying to do is change structures, not only do the sort of short-term emergency work that's often needed in a community, but also building the stronger-term networks that help that community thrive on its own, in its own terms, and how it understands itself to be. So those are some of the places I see that.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And I really saw pieces of this in you did a sermon in Cleveland where you spoke about Matthew 25 and inviting the stranger and helping the stranger, and it was a really good sermon.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if there's any intersections with your studies or your research with anarchism. And notable anarchists have been affiliated with Christianity, such as the Berrigan Brothers, Dorothy Day. And one thing I see in womanist ethics is a focus on control and autonomy. Can you talk about any intersections you have with anarchism? Or?
Yeah, I don't have any that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean I don't have any, if that makes sense. But I don't think consciously in terms of anarchist thought. And I'm just sort of checking myself there. No, that doesn't tend to be me, unless you're talking about people like James Cone, Dolores Williams, Katie Cannon, those folks, Cornel West. Then you might be able to make I might be able to make a case, but they don't tend to call themselves anarchists, and so I'm not going to put that label on them. But I do believe you cannot. I don't want my work to be supportive of a status quo that kills and maims people.
It does have a lot of intersections with liberation theology, and on this topic of the big talk right now of Antifa and anti-fascists, I wanted to go back to someone you've done a lot of research on, which was Ida B. Wells Barnett. Who, way before the Patriot Act, someone who was actually fighting terrorism and terrorists. And this was Ida B. Wells with her journalism, her advocacy. She helped organize the Illinois' first Black Woman Club, first Black Orchestra in Chicago, first kindergarten for Black children. And this was in 1892, when her close friend Thomas Moss was lynched. If you could speak about fighting fascism and what we could learn from Ida B. Wells.
Don't try and go it alone. And that was probably her biggest flaw as an organizer. She was impatient in working through networks and coalitions, and if people were too slow or disagreed with her approach, she would just strike out on her own. That's wonderful to a certain point, but what that also did was it didn't leave a body of knowledge of how to do what she did, so that when she was gone, her style, her knowledge of how to get things done was gone with her. And that was my biggest disappointment in her. I mean, I'm not sure I would have been friends with her if we had lived in the same era. But yeah, you had to give the woman a lot of credit for getting a lot of stuff done. But she did it in such a way that it wasn't building a movement. She didn't build a movement. She was part of movements and important parts of movements, but she was often too much a lone ranger. And so one of the things that I really wished had been true for her was that she would have been able to teach others more about how to do the kind of rabble-rousing she did. And that just was not in her plan.
Yeah, and I've heard Bill Hooks talk about the need for Black women to consciously create an archive and to have those things saved, because they so often get lost, and it's irreplaceable. And I'd like to talk about the historian Niebuhr, who
which one? H. Richard or Reinhold?
Yes, Richard, yes. And he said that he sought to pay attention to what is happening around us and to look beyond. We just came to the anniversary of Charlottesville, and there was a big far-right rally in Portland. And I'm kind of wondering how, through this lens, how you're seeing this, if you see it as a rise of fascism, or if it's just something now that the media, like you said, is paying attention to, or your feelings on this current moment.
Well, because the media is paying more attention to it, it is getting much more exposure, but I really think it's always been there. When former President Obama was first elected, people around me were all excited, and I said, you have not yet seen how ugly it's going to get, because I don't know that people really appreciated what they've just done in electing him as president. And within a month, if I had wanted to, I could have said, see, I told you so. So this is the amount of hate and vitriol that's in the alt-right music movement has always been there for as long as I've been old, and I'm almost 65. And I know it goes back a lot further than that. It may not have been polite to show it in public. It may not have been well advised to loose it, but it's out there now. And frankly, I'd rather it be exposed than people sit on it and let it fester.
Kind of opening that wound and cleaning it out by then just ignoring it and normalizing it. This question kind of ties in, and it's about post-traumatic stress and intergenerational transmission of trauma. If there's been any intersections with your research on this, you've mentioned that James Baldwin, in his essay Many Thousands Gone, explains that dehumanization is never a one-way street. I was wondering if you had some thoughts on trauma and transmission and healing these wounds, or looking at them.
Well, yes and no. I'm a little skeptical of many forms of trauma theory that are out there now, because I think they make the sort of insipid nature of trauma a little too simplistic, and it's become somewhat of a fad. I do think people experience trauma. In fact, I know we do. And so for me, when I'm thinking about trauma, I'm thinking about the ways in which systemic and systematic forms of evil and destruction, like the isms, the various isms, find a place in the human heart, mind, and soul, and then begin to operate within us as business as usual, to the degree that we don't even understand how much it is also wounding us and causing us to lash out of ourselves the ways in which that kind of hurt, only that kind of hurt, can create in the human spirit. So for me, I'm wanting to look more at systems and structures and the ways that the individual responds. And one of those ways is exceedingly traumatic for the impact it has or the legacy it leaves.
Thank you for that, those comments on that.
Mm-hmm.
I really like this quote you have that pertains to climate change. And I know you've quoted the Christian ecologist before, the Larry Rasmussen.
Mm-hmm.
He said, quote, if we refuse to engage in dismantling systemic and intentional structural evil, we only leave a parched and desolate land for generations to come. And this really made me think about the indigenous movements that are the ones that are really fighting for the environment right now, which is with fighting the DAPL pipeline with Standing Rock in North Dakota,
mm-hmm.
the Bayou Bridge in Louisiana where that pipeline ended, and groups in Alberta, Canada. And I was wondering, your current thoughts on climate change and some meditations on this. I know you've been writing about this more.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's kind of hard. I think you have to work awfully hard not to notice that the climate has changed. The Earth is getting hotter. Things are melting that shouldn't be melting. And it's our action, and more importantly, our inaction, that is helping that move along at all deliberate speed. I have not a whole lot of patience for people who wonder, is climate change real? Too much is going on that says every day, look, okay, well, how many days of 95-plus degree heat are we having in Nashville just over the last 2 weeks? And, yeah, Nashville gets hot in the summer, but not like this. We never had winter this winter. It never got into the winter temperatures that we were used to. So it's sort of, even just casual observation. The number of animals that are going into extinction because their habitats are no longer viable for them, either by human folly or the environment itself being destroyed. So, yeah.
I was reading this. You often hear this quote by Marx that says, "The opiate of religion is the opiate of the masses."
Mm-hmm.
It was
Keep
John
reading
Clark.
it.
Yeah. Yes. And John Clark pointed out the next part is religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, and the spirit of spiritless conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And that really says so much, that religion is the heart and spirit of so much. I was wondering if you had any meditations on this. I feel this is what you're writing really emboldened, are these two things, heart and spirit.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I actually read all of what Mark said about that, I thought, well, it's interesting. People drop that last part off.
Yeah.
Now, it's a complex paragraph, to be sure, but it seems to me that forms of religiosity that do not invite us into our better and best selves and then encourage us to bring others along with us, not because we're right, but because it's just and fair. That's a religion I want to be a part of. Anything else is not really what I want to sign up for.
This is my last question.
Okay.
And you wrote a large chapter in Womenist Ethics on reparations, and this recent reparations bill was put forth, and I went back and read your chapter again, and it seemed like Mitch McConnell was reiterating everything you had said people say on the topic of reparations, such as and I just thought this chapter was so pertinent to what's going on right now, and some reflections you may have on this, and the talk that Ta-Nehisi Coates gave at the Senate was very great as well.
Well, I continue to think that reparations is not the issue. The issue is empire and global capitalism and the impact that it continues to have in our daily lives. And I want us to focus on that more, because there's a way in which I haven't seen too many plans of reparation that actually attack the systemic injustice of darker-skinned people. Mm-hmm. It tends to offer individualistic, here's a check. And we need more than that. We need more than that to undo the mess we have done.
By looking, maybe if these reparations included calls for steps to prison abolition and all these other things you're talking about that are entangled inside of the empire. And
right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Towns, for...
Yeah, you're welcome.
Today.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of the Time Talks podcast, and thank you to Dr. Towns for speaking with me. Please support her work. Shout out to Awareness for the Music. Please rate and share the show, and happy Halloween.